The evening light settled softly over the cliffs of the Forrester estate, turning the glass walls of the mansion into sheets of molten gold. Inside, however, there was nothing gentle about the air. It pulsed with anticipation, fragile and electric, as if the house itself sensed that something irreversible was about to unfold. Electra stood alone near the sweeping staircase, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had turned pale. She had rehearsed the words in her mind all afternoon, shaping them carefully, measuring every possibility. Tonight, she would finally speak the truth about her heart, about RJ, about the direction of her future, about the love she believed she was ready to claim openly, without fear. Her reflection in the tall mirror opposite her seemed both familiar and foreign. She looked composed, even luminous in the warm glow of the chandeliers. Yet inside she was trembling. Too much had happened in recent weeks. The rupture with Will had left scars she had not yet fully examined. The quiet pull toward RJ had grown from comfort into something deeper, something undeniable. She no longer wanted to live suspended between past and present, between regret and possibility. She intended to tell the Forrester family, clearly, decisively, that she was choosing RJ, that she was ready to move forward. She did not realize that fate had chosen a different script for the night. The sound of heels against marble echoed sharply from the foyer, slicing through her concentration. Electra turned, startled, as Daphne entered the room without ceremony. There was no polite greeting, no hesitant smile. Daphne's face was set in a rigid seriousness that felt out of place in the otherwise elegant surroundings. In her hand, she held a small black recording device, its metallic surface catching the chandelier light like a blade. Electra's heartbeat stuttered. Daphne did not waste time with preamble. She moved to the center of the room, her posture tense but resolute, and announced that before Electra made any declarations about her future, there was something she needed to hear. The weight in her tone erased any trace of casual concern. This was not gossip, it was a reckoning. With deliberate fingers, Daphne pressed the playback button. The room filled with the unmistakable sound of Ivy's voice. At first, it was subtle, almost playful. Ivy's laughter carried a familiar lilt, the warmth that had always drawn Electra toward her aunt in moments of doubt. But as the recording continued, the tone shifted. The laughter hardened into something colder, sharper. Ivy spoke without restraint, unaware that her confession would ever reach its intended victims. She described, in chilling detail, how she had engineered misunderstandings between Electra and Will. She explained how easily jealousy could be cultivated, how a carefully placed remark, a manipulated photograph, a delayed message could fracture trust. She admitted to exaggerating conversations, to misrepresenting intentions, to planting seeds of suspicion until they blossomed into resentment. Electra felt the blood drain from her face. The words were precise, calculated. Ivy recounted the night she had encouraged Will to believe that Electra was already emotionally invested elsewhere. She described whispering subtle doubts into Electra's ear about Will's loyalty. She boasted about how fragile young love could be when tested by insecurity. The cruelty was not impulsive. It was methodical. She confessed that she believed Will was not right for Electra, that he would only drag her into the chaos of Spencer ambition. She rationalized her actions as protective, as necessary intervention. But beneath the justification lay something unmistakable, control. She had wanted to shape Electra's choices, to steer her future according to her own vision, regardless of the emotional wreckage left behind. When the playback ended, the silence that followed was suffocating. Electra did not move at first. Her mind struggled to reconcile the Ivy in the recording with the woman she had trusted for years. Ivy had been her confidant, her advisor, the steady presence in family turbulence. To discover that the same woman had orchestrated the unraveling of her relationship with Will felt like betrayal of the deepest kind. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the edge of the sofa, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. The grief was immediate and raw. It was not only the loss of a romantic relationship she mourned. It was the collapse of a bond she had believed unbreakable. The idea that her own aunt had manipulated her heartbreak for strategic purposes shattered something foundational within her. Daphne watched quietly, her expression a mixture of sorrow and grim determination. She had not brought the recording lightly. She had struggled with the implications, with the damage it would cause. But the truth, once uncovered, demanded exposure. Footsteps sounded again in the hallway, quicker this time, urgent. RJ entered just as Electra lifted her tear-streaked face, and he immediately sensed that something catastrophic had occurred. He glanced between Electra and Daphne, then noticed the recording device still clutched in Daphne's hand. He did not have to wait long for explanation. Daphne replayed the recording. RJ stood rigid as Ivy's voice filled the room again, each admission striking him like a physical blow. He had grown up surrounded by complex family dynamics, by rivalry and ambition, but hearing such deliberate manipulation spoken so plainly was disorienting. Ivy was not merely misguided. She had been strategic. She had weaponized trust. Before the shock could fully settle, another presence entered the threshold. Will. He had not intended to return to the Forrester estate that evening. But instinct, or perhaps unfinished emotion, had drawn him there. He stopped just inside the doorway, unnoticed at first, as the final seconds of the recording echoed through the vast room. His expression hardened as comprehension dawned. Ivy's voice described the precise moment she had told him that Electra was already drifting away. That she had seen signs of betrayal before he could. She admitted to amplifying every insecurity he had confessed. She had known exactly where to press. Will's hands curled into fists. When the recording stopped, the confrontation could no longer be postponed. Ivy herself appeared moments later, summoned by the disturbance, unaware that her carefully constructed narrative had already collapsed. She froze when she saw the faces turn toward her, Electra devastated, RJ stunned, Will burning with anger, Daphne resolute. The evidence lay between them. Ivy attempted composure. She asked questions, feigned confusion. But when Daphne held up the device and stated plainly what it contained, the pretense cracked. Ivy's gaze flickered, not with innocence but with calculation. She tried to explain. She insisted that she had only acted out of concern, that she had seen patterns in the Spencer family that frightened her. She argued that Will's intensity, his ambition, his entanglement in corporate warfare, would have consumed Electra. She claimed she had merely accelerated an inevitable separation. But her words rang hollow against the recording. Will stepped forward, his voice trembling not with doubt but with fury. He demanded to know how she could so casually dismantle something that had once meant everything to him. He accused her of stealing not just a relationship but trust itself. His anger was not theatrical. It was wounded, deeply personal. Electra rose slowly to her feet, her tears replaced by a steadier, colder resolve. She looked at Ivy not as niece to aunt but as victim to architect. The hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. She told Ivy that love, however imperfect, had never been hers to control. That even if Will and she had eventually parted ways on their own, the decision should have been theirs, not engineered behind closed doors. RJ stood between them all, torn. Ivy was family. So was Electra. Loyalty tugged in opposing directions. He understood Ivy's protective instincts, yet he could not ignore the damage inflicted. For a long moment, he remained silent, weighing blood against principle. In the end, he stepped closer to Electra. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. Ivy saw it. The realization that she had lost not only control but allegiance flickered across her face. The narrative she had constructed was collapsing faster than she could repair it. Electra's voice, when she finally spoke again, carried no hesitation. She declared that trust once broken in such a deliberate way could not be restored through apology. She announced that she would no longer allow Ivy's influence in her life. The bond of family did not excuse betrayal. It magnified it. Ivy's defenses crumbled then, not into remorse but into wounded pride. She insisted that they would regret casting her aside, that one day they would understand her motives. But even as she spoke, she knew the moment had passed. Will's anger remained unresolved, but beneath it flickered something more complex. The knowledge that their love had been sabotaged did not automatically restore it. Too much had changed. Too much had been said and believed. Yet the clarity brought a strange relief. Their separation had not been born of simple incompatibility. It had been engineered. RJ, sensing the fragile state of everything around him, realized that his own future with Electra could not be declared in the shadow of such revelation. The evening that had been meant to celebrate new beginnings had transformed into a reckoning of old wounds. As night deepened beyond the glass walls, Ivy retreated from the estate. No dramatic farewell, no reconciliation. She left alone, the click of the door echoing like a final note. But the story did not end with her departure. Hours later, as the Forrester mansion settled into uneasy quiet, Electra's phone vibrated on the bedside table. She hesitated before glancing at the screen. A single message. No sender name, only a number. The text was brief, chilling in its restraint. This isn't over. Electra's breath caught. Outside, somewhere beyond the estate's manicured grounds, Ivy walked through the darkness with purpose. Exposure had not broken her. It had merely altered her strategy. The humiliation of being unmasked festered into something sharper. Inside the mansion, alliances had shifted. Trust had been redefined. Love, once sabotaged, hovered uncertainly between past and future. And as Electra stared at the message glowing in the dark, she understood that betrayal had been revealed. But vengeance had only just begun. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Eric Forrester's living room, casting long streaks of amber across the polished floors and the sketches scattered on the grand table between him and Ridge. The house, usually a sanctuary of artistry and legacy, felt charged with something volatile. The air seemed heavier than usual, thick with unspoken rivalry and old wounds that had never fully healed. Eric stood near the fireplace, a portfolio of new design renderings clutched in his hands, his voice sharp with restrained indignation. Ridge faced him from across the room, equally unyielding, his posture rigid, his jaw set with familiar defiance. Brooke and Katie sat nearby, caught in the crossfire of a father and son battle that had defined decades of the Forrester empire. The argument began as a professional disagreement but quickly evolved into something far more personal. Eric accused Ridge of abandoning the house's heritage in favor of aggressive modernism, of forgetting that fashion at Forrester Creations was not just about innovation but about legacy, about the quiet elegance that had once defined their name. Ridge countered that stagnation disguised as tradition would suffocate the company, that the world was changing and they could not cling to the past without risking irrelevance. Their words overlapped, sharpened by years of unresolved tension, by pride and the unspoken fear of obsolescence. Brooke watched them with a mixture of concern and weary familiarity. She had witnessed variations of this confrontation countless times. She tried to interject with calm logic, suggesting compromise, pointing out that both visions could coexist within a single collection. Yet her attempts at mediation only seemed to intensify the friction. Ridge interpreted her support of certain designs as partiality. Eric interpreted her tone as subtle criticism of his judgment. The room vibrated with ego and insecurity. Katie, seated quietly on the sofa, attempted to soften the atmosphere. She offered gentle humor, reminded them that family should not fracture over sketches on paper. But as the debate escalated, her voice grew fainter. A subtle pressure began to bloom in her chest, a tightness she first dismissed as anxiety. She shifted slightly, pressing a hand against her sternum, inhaling more deeply than usual. No one noticed. The spotlight of emotion remained fixed on Eric and Ridge, whose argument had become less about fabric and silhouette and more about authority and identity. The tension mounted to a near unbearable pitch. Ridge stepped closer to the table, pointing to specific designs, accusing Eric of sentimentality. Eric's response carried a sting of wounded pride, reminding his son who had built the foundation upon which Ridge now stood. Brooke attempted again to mediate, her voice trembling slightly as she appealed to their shared love for the brand and for each other. Yet every sentence seemed to ignite a new spark. Katie's discomfort intensified. The pressure in her chest radiated outward, her breathing shallow and irregular. A faint ringing filled her ears, drowning out the raised voices around her. She tried to speak, to call Brooke's name, but the words would not form clearly. The room tilted subtly, then violently. She clutched the edge of the sofa, her vision blurring. And then, without warning, her body gave way. The sound of her collapse shattered the argument mid-sentence. Brooke's head snapped toward her sister just in time to see her crumple onto the floor. Her face pale, her eyes unfocused. The transformation from heated debate to raw panic was instantaneous. Eric dropped the sketches. Ridge rushed forward. Brooke fell to her knees beside Katie, her hands trembling as she cradled her sister's head. Katie's breaths came in uneven gasps, each one shallower than the last. Brooke called her name repeatedly, desperation overtaking composure. Ridge dialed emergency services with shaking fingers. Eric stood frozen for a moment, the weight of what had just occurred eclipsing all previous conflict. Within minutes that felt like hours, paramedics filled the once elegant living room with the clinical urgency of flashing lights and clipped instructions. Brooke refused to let go of Katie's hand as they lifted her onto a stretcher. Bill arrived at the hospital shortly after, his expression already strained with dread, as if he had sensed catastrophe before receiving the call. The sterile brightness of the hospital corridor contrasted cruelly with the warmth of Eric's living room. Bill stood rigid near the wall, fists clenched, anger replaced by helplessness. Ridge and Eric remained close, their earlier argument now trivial in the face of uncertainty. When the doctor finally approached, his face carried the practiced solemnity of someone accustomed to delivering life-altering news. He explained that Katie's condition was critical. A severe organ failure had gone undetected until it reached a catastrophic stage. Immediate transplantation was not optional, it was essential. Without it, her prognosis was grim. The words seemed to echo unnaturally in the hallway. Bill's composure cracked visibly. The idea of losing Katie, despite their complicated history, felt unthinkable. Brooke felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her again. But this time there was no letter, no rivalry, no betrayal to blame. There was only biology and the fragile unpredictability of life. The doctor continued, explaining that compatibility testing had already been initiated among close relatives. His tone shifted subtly as he revealed the results. There was only one viable match. Brooke Logan. The name hung in the air like a suspended verdict. Brooke stared at the doctor, momentarily unable to process the implication. She felt every pair of eyes in the corridor turn toward her. Bill stepped forward instinctively, his desperation immediate and unfiltered. He grasped her hands, his voice breaking as he implored her to save Katie, to give her the chance to live. He emphasized that time was not on their side, that every delay increased the risk. Brooke's mind spiraled. The request was both simple and impossibly complex. Of course she loved Katie. Of course she wanted her to live. But the decision was not abstract. It involved her own body, her own vulnerability. Surgery carried risk. Recovery would not be easy. And layered beneath the medical urgency were years of shared history. Love, rivalry, forgiveness, resentment. Her bond with Katie had been forged through both intimacy and conflict. Their sisterhood was deep but not without scars. Bill's presence intensified the emotional weight. Their past was intricate, interwoven with passion and betrayal. The thought of undergoing such a sacrifice for Katie while standing before Bill stirred old wounds she had long tried to quiet. Ridge stepped closer, his expression softer than it had been all evening. He did not pressure her. He understood the gravity of what was being asked. Eric's eyes reflected both hope and concern. They both recognized that Brooke was being placed at the center of a life or death decision no one should face lightly. Brooke felt the corridor closing in around her. Images of childhood memories with Katie flooded her mind. Shared secrets, whispered dreams, laughter that once felt effortless. She remembered protecting her younger sister from heartbreak, standing beside her through crises. She also remembered moments of betrayal, of romantic entanglements that strained their bond. Their relationship had never been simple. But beneath every complication lay something fundamental. Blood, shared history, unspoken understanding. The doctor reminded them gently that time was critical. Brooke requested a moment alone. She walked to the end of the corridor, leaning against the cool wall, trying to steady her breathing. The decision was not merely medical. It was existential. She understood the risks. She understood that her choice would alter the trajectory of multiple lives. Yet she also understood that doing nothing was, in itself, a decision. Back in the waiting area, Bill paced like a caged storm. Ridge watched Brooke from a distance, aware that whatever she chose would redefine everything between them. Eric closed his eyes briefly, praying silently for clarity and strength. The camera of fate seemed to narrow its focus onto Brooke's face as she returned to them. Her expression torn between fear and fierce love. The weight of legacy, of rivalry, of complicated romance, all faded before the stark reality of sisterhood and mortality. The episode ended not with resolution, but with the unbearable pause before one. Brooke stood in the hospital corridor, every memory and every fear converging within her. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her lips parted as if on the verge of speaking. Around her, the world seemed suspended, waiting. Her decision would determine whether Katie lived. And as the scene closed on her conflicted face, the question remained suspended in silence. Would love overcome fear? Or would the ghosts of the past hold her back when her sister's life hung in the balance?